Well, good morning, friends, or good afternoon, or whatever time it is. Welcome back to our study in the Gospel of Mark here at the Berean Post. And I'm Dwayne, the host. And as I've said many times before, this is my journey. And we're just trying to open the Word the way the first readers heard it and letting it hit us fresh. And today we're going to try something new. I'm adding video just to see how hard it would be to run this more than just the audio. So it's just me here, one man show. So let me know if you like having the video and if it's something that's worth keeping up. But getting back to what we are doing here, we're taking a look at Mark chapter 5, 25 to 34. And it's a story that sits right in the middle of Jairus' story. But it deserves to be heard on its own. It's the story of a woman that's desperate, rejected, and forgotten. And yet, in one moment, she hears Jesus call her daughter. So let's start with the text. We're going to jump right in. Mark chapter 5, verses 25 to 34. It says, "Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, 'If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well.' And immediately," there's that word again, "immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my clothes?' But his disciples said to him, 'You see the multitudes thronging you, and you say, Who touched me?' And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction.'" Think about this now. For 12 years, I've said this before, that when I do my Bible study and I'm understanding the context, I want to get as much context as I can so I can really immerse myself into the passage. So let's do that here for a moment. For 12 years, let's imagine this woman for 12 years. She woke up to the same verdict every single day: unclean, unclean, unclean. Every bed, every chair, every hand she touched was marked as being contaminated. Not for a week, but for 12 years. Not just a season, 12 whole years. Today we'd probably call her condition chronic menophagia. I think that's what how you pronounce it. I'm not a doctor, but it's this constant bleeding, and they say it can come from fibroids or endometriosis. Women who live with this today can tell you it means being anemic, weak, the constant feeling of fatigue, accompanied with pain at times that just doesn't go away. Well, that was her body, frail, pale, and trembling. And then Mark adds, she suffered many things from many physicians. That wasn't a polite way of saying she had a few checkups. Because ancient medicine was just brutal. Like, for instance, okay, the Talmud talks about a curse, talks about curses like carrying ashes, cures rather. Sorry, the Talmud talks about cures like carrying the ashes of ostrich eggs, drinking onion wine, or sitting over burning vapors. In the Greek Roman world, the doctors prescribed things like fumigations, invasive pessaries, and even bloodletting, which made her anemia worse. Egyptian papyri describes remedies with crocodile dung and sour milk, and every attempt at her trying to get well would just cost money. Every attempt drained her of her dignity, and at the end of it all, she was worse. She wasn't just sick; she got worse. And I think about that phrase, "suffered many things," and it makes me think of the ache. She wasn't just a patient; she was a victim of her condition, a victim of her community's rejection, and a victim of a system that promised cures but only drained her both dry of energy, and monetary resources. And I realized that many today know that same story. I've tried everything. I've seen every doctor. I've spent everything, and I'm worse now than when I started. Maybe that's you listening or watching. If that's you, then you already understand what her despair is. Now, picture after 12 years of that, being pale, frail, broken, alone, despised. She walks into the street and it's jammed. Jairus, the synagogue ruler, he can walk right up. The crowd seemed to just part because respect will do that. It makes room for those we consider to be respectable. But this woman, there's no way being made open for her. She's got no clear path. She has to push, shove, and fight her way through. And here's what really stands out to me. Mark says that the crowd was thronging Jesus, that dozens of people were pushing up against him. Some were curious, some were wanting a miracle, some were just along for the show, but they still had their safety nets. They had their families, they had their social standing, they had their support. But this woman had nothing left but him. And she says to herself, if I can just touch his garment. And she reaches for that tassel. Basically Numbers 15 reminds us of the curse that's on this woman. But then there's the scripture that may have came to her in Malachi 4 that speaks of healing in his wings, and that healing could be found if she just touches the tassel of his garment. And then instantly there's that word. She knows. The bleeding stops, and all of a sudden life just starts flushing and running back in. And then Jesus stops and he says, wait a minute, who touched me? The disciples, again, they laugh. Look at the crowd, everyone's touching you, but Jesus knew this wasn't a casual touch. It was desperate faith. And the woman, well, she trembles. She expects a rebuke. She expects maybe to be shamed. But instead, Jesus looks at her and says to a word she thought she would never ever hear again, daughter. And you know something? This is the only place in the Gospels that Jesus uses that word in reference to a woman or a girl. The only time. He calls her daughter. So after 12 years, think about that. After 12 years of rejection, she hears family language. She hears covenantal belonging. She hears God's heart. And this story, when we read the Bible, we need to understand, we don't read it and think, okay, this story is about me somehow. And I've heard so many devotionals and sermons set up that way about your Goliath. And no, this story is first not about us. It's first about Jesus. And what Mark wanted the first readers to see and understand about Jesus. They would have felt the weight of this woman's exclusion. Leviticus 15 made it clear she was unclean, cut off from worship, cut off from covenant life. They would have noticed the contrast between her and Jairus the ruler, honored, this woman shamed. Both coming to Jesus, both falling at his feet. They would have seen the Christological shock that Jesus isn't defiled by her touch like the leopard. Instead of Jesus being contaminated, as the law would say, this woman's not defiled by her touch. He's not made unclean by her touch. Instead, his holiness flows outward. It flows into her, and it makes her clean. They would have heard the word daughter, and they would have thought of covenantal restoration. So for Mark's audience, believers in Rome, some Jewish, some Gentile, facing shame and exclusion, this story was a declaration. Jesus sees the broken. He restores the outcasts, and he calls them into family. It makes me think of the passage in the Old Testament. I don't know the reference right now. You can probably look it up if you want to, but it says that God takes the lonely and he puts them into families. So when I read this, I hear Isaiah. I hear Isaiah. I hear a bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. And that's who she was, a broken reed, despised by everybody else. Probably she was despised by herself, but Jesus doesn't break reeds, he restores them. And here's the truth. There was plenty of people in that crowd who touched him, but walked away unchanged. Why? I don't really know, but maybe they weren't desperate enough. Maybe they still had their nets, their safety systems, their pride. They still had something, but she had nothing. She had nothing but him and her hope in him. And James reminds us that God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Her condition forced her into humility, but that wasn't a curse. It was grace. Because she reached out empty, what she found was Jesus. She found him full. So let's bring this home a little bit, and I'll be honest, I've seen this kind of thing sort of play out in church, where you get well-known people or a wealthy family that get different sorts of accesses to different sorts of people and privileges. But the single mom, she slips in and out. She's unnoticed. The addict stays on the margin. He doesn't quite fit in. Crowds still today make room for some, but push others back. But this story tells me that Jesus noticed the ones that the crowds will ignore. And I know what it's like to feel like a broken reed. I know what it's like to feel like a broken reed. And maybe you do too. Maybe you've felt rejected and invisible, convinced that God wouldn't want you or that you can't help or serve in any way. And if that's you, then this woman's story is your story. And the same voice that called her daughter is calling you daughter or son. Your faith has made you whole. Go in peace. Well, that's it for today. I want to thank you for joining me in the studies in the Gospel of Mark. And if this episode encouraged you, would you please do me a favor? Share it with a friend, hit like, and even better yet, subscribe so you don't miss the next study. And you can follow along at the Berean Post. We've got blogs there. We've got some other materials. It's thebereanpost.ca. And now we're on YouTube, rss.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and some other major platforms. And if this is your first time, and since rather this is my first time trying to record the video as well as audio in this season, in this, line of episodes that we're doing then on Mark, then please let me know if it's helpful and if you like to keep seeing the video in the episodes, or if it's just as well having just the audio only. I'd love to hear your feedback. New episodes are coming regularly, and as we walk through the Gospel of Mark together, make sure you keep in touch and you sign up. So until next time, grace and peace to your homes.